In my most recent video, we looked at the difference between that kind of L to L swooshy pattern that we're all kind of taught from the beginning, and the seemingly more advanced pattern that was in that video promoted by Pete Cowen and through Danny Maud. And that was the idea that the right wrist stays extended through impact, and we really kind of apply pressure and keep that wrist extended. Now, I've had some brilliant responses on this, and some of you have asked me, is that feel and real, or does it really happen? Is it possible, when we look at the 3D data, to keep that right wrist extended through impact? Well, I know just the person to speak to here is my good friend Dr. Mark Ball, who's a regular contributor to the channel, and he will have all that data and more. So in this session, we're going to see if we can really find out some answers. So let's get started. First of all, thank you as always for your time, Mark, much appreciated. I suppose the most obvious question to start with is, what is the release pattern? When people say release pattern, what are they actually talking about?
I mean, in essence, Noel, is really how someone delivers the club into impact. So how is that club, in a very kind of loose sense, kind of being moved into and approaching impact?
And is that a role of the wrists and the arms, or the whole system?
It's the whole human. So for sure, we will see it locally, say, through what the hands and wrist does. But the whole human's involved in that. How the feet move, how the head moves, how the spine moves, what an influence and contribute to then while the wrists and hands do what they do. Okay.
I knew this wouldn't be simple. We like to think about it as how the wrists and arms move through impact in conjunction with the body. But what Mark's saying here is how you move from the ground up has huge influence on what's happening with the handle and how you're able to then deliver the club. Things like your speed and the forces you're applying, where the club face is in space, all these things are going to affect it. It's never going to be just a case of which model I like to think about. So in your experience and with all the data you have, would you say there are distinctly different release patterns just from a data perspective?
I think there's variability. There's these different ways the club can be moved into impact for sure, but you just see it on a much more variable scale. So some people do less of this, some players do kind of more of that, but loosely speaking, the club, you look at how the hands and wrists move into impact, there's a thread that runs through most deliveries. They just do it to different levels at different times. So you look at, say, what is the historical release? You look at, say, historically, it'd be the idea of the kind of thumbs moving downwards as someone kind of rotates kind of through their pelvis and through their spine. So it's kind of how you align and match those movements. And this is the very historical way that through downswing, the thumbs go downwards as we rotate through, for example, the pelvis and the
body. And in a previous video, I kind of highlighted that most of us kind of coach, certainly at beginner level, this idea of thumbs go down and then the arms cross over in that kind of L to L fashion. I mean, is that something you see? The arms then crossing over?
Yes, I mean, then you look at more, that's a response then to kind of what happens in advance. And there's many reasons why, as you would say, Noel, the kind of hands and forearms do this through impact. Do the hands and forearms move that way? Yes. Do players actively try and encourage that? No, which is then the discussion.
Right, and this is an advanced player, isn't it?
Yes, you look at, say, any real kind of recreational, kind of, aspirational player. Do they actively try and rotate the forearm? Less so. Yeah. But does the forearm rotate? Invariably, yes, because it's responding to things that happen in advance.
So that's that skill continuum, isn't it? That journey from basics to being an advanced player. We do actually do things differently. And I would most definitely be encouraging players of a novice level to be turning that right arm over and get some kind of agency, some kind of control over how they rotate the face. But I also know as a reasonably good player, that is something I would never try and do. But as Mark says, it does happen. The arms are rotating, but it's not me actively doing that. And at some point along that journey, things start to change. And in fact, I would be actually resisting that arm turning over and trying to keep the face straighter, because there's other torques and forces that are going to be squaring the face. It's not going to be down to me having to make that motion. Okay, Mark, so the big question and the one that I've really come here to ask you is, some models have more of this kind of swooshy pattern where the club is like kind of swooshing a stick, and you would sort of get the energy going that way, and some coaches would promote more of a drive through the right arm and keeping the right wrist extended. To what level, through the data that you've sort of lived with for the last two decades, do you see that right wrist staying extended, and what are the influences on that?
Yeah, I think, again, you need to give it context now. It really connects back to what shot or what flight is someone trying to hit. So to say there's an approach to release the club, is almost removed from what flight are you actually trying to play. So someone trying to encourage certain ball flights, that can then actively stimulate, for example, different kind of releases. So going back to the previous one, and the idea of the wrist being extended, it may be an extension, but it's still moving towards a flex position.
Right.
I think I'd have to sit in a dark room and probably still find no one that post-impact the right wrist or trail wrist is extended post-impact. So we look at that with context. It comes from an extended position, but it's moving towards flexion.
Okay, but that is, so back to our swing models now. We're starting to get into this. So, but that is different to actively swooshing it with that wrist, isn't it?
Yeah. I would actually look at, the only difference there is the timing of those releases. You actually look at there's a very similar thread there. Both of those approaches are discussing the idea of flexion, extension of the wrist. The difference is the time of when it goes into an actively flexed position.
Okay, so at some point the forces on the handle are going to take the wrist out of extension, aren't they?
And then you look at it more that way. Really, what controls and influences the ranges that the wrist goes through is the forces the club's both producing and also being exposed to.
Right. Okay.
So when we produce speed or force on the club, the human also has to absorb those forces. How we move through the wrist reveals much about how we're absorbing force.
So to try and have a release pattern that looks like your favourite really powerful player without those kind of speed and forces, you're probably not going to get the same looks.
Absolutely right. So you have the club's moving through space, for example, in transition, moving excessively this way or moving excessively that way. That will absolutely influence and control how those wrists then move through space. So the bigger question is explore how the club moves.
Right.
From that, the fallout becomes then the wrist will respond to that. Rather than the other way, we look at what the wrists do to try and influence what the club does.
So rather than, so hold on a minute. So rather than trying to work the wrists heavily and trying to extend the wrists here, what you're saying then is actually think more about how you're trying to move the club and your body, and that then exerts a force on the wrists, as opposed to let's do this with the wrists and then the body will kind of work it out.
Absolutely right. I mean, I think it's a much more organic way, it's a much more realistic way of learning as well. To actively try and move the wrists in a certain way, it's achievable for sure, it's just a lot more demanding.
And I suppose the other thing then would be the body's influence on that. So just very simply, if a player is for whatever reason less able to rotate athletically through the ball, would you see a different kind of release pattern, and would you promote that? Yeah,
I mean that's a nice question. So for example, you look at very much to the viewers now, people that actively kind of thrust their pelvis into downs, which is it's a very recurrent movement.
The early extension, as we know, in YouTube world.
The pelvis is moving forwards. That would then absolutely influence what the wrist does. So it's not unusual to see, for example, that when the pelvis moves towards the ball, we then start to see more of the thumbs downwards, and as you say, then post-impact, much more rotation through both of those forearms.
Right.
So it's looking at it in a much more contextual way. The wrists are moving that way because they're moving in line with how the pelvis moves.
So essentially, your release pattern is, I mean, we can have all these great intentions for how we want to release it and these models, but it is influenced so heavily by how you move in a multitude of other different ways.
Yeah.
Are we saying it's almost a kind of secondary to all the other things?
Yeah.
Or could we see it the other way? Could you have really clear intentions on how you try and release it, and is the body likely to self-organise around that, or is that less likely? I
mean, it really is both of that. No, I mean, a very playful way you could say to your viewers is, can you aim left and try and push it, aim right, try and pull it, and just then start to observe how you start to kind of move differently through the club, based on, let's say, left and try and push it, let's say right, try and pull it. What experience you didn't have around what the wrist then do based on just a change in, say, the demand of the task.
So, and from my experience coaching this kind of stuff, when we look at a release pattern that we don't like, and we start to get really specific on the release and what the wrists do and attach things to our arms, that seems to miss the point a lot. Whereas when you change the task and and encourage different ball flights and move the body differently, then we start to see a different release pattern.
And I think going back to, I can only give you my experiences now, looking at the data. If you said the last 50, the last 100, last 1,000 sessions I've done, and this is just my approach, and that's, again, right or wrong, good luck defining that. When did I last actively try and encourage a different release of the club? I'd have to sit in a very dark room and probably still give you No one.
It wouldn't be something you would.
No.
You might see a release pattern that you don't like necessarily, but you would never directly target that.
You look at what drives it. What's the system? What's motivating the wrist to move that way? But equally so, in those last 50, 100, 1,000 sessions I've done, when you start looking at, say, rotation, club delivery, task understanding, all those different areas, almost always the release then responds and the wrist moves differently. So I think in particular for your viewers now, one of the nicest ways of exploring this is really what influences release more than most things is the player's awareness of where the club face is in swing. So an example would be in the top of back swing, the club face is very close, for example.
Right.
That will hugely influence on how they release the club into impact. Vice versa, if the club face is very open at the top, that will then require a different way of delivering that club into impact.
Can you be more specific there? So if we've got the face shut, I guess the thing there is to not let it go left, so that's going to be a different pattern, isn't it?
Yeah, so
what would you see in those kind of swings?
So looking at, say, just around how the hands and wrists move, then you often then will see, loosely speaking, more flexion, extensions through that kind of leading trail wrist respectively.
If the face is close,
precisely,
strong in the backswing.
Yeah. So that you could almost associate with kind of more lean, for example, in the shaft,
Yeah.
keeping it in very kind of informal language today, more kind of flexions to the lead wrist, extension for their trail wrist. That's their way of then almost trying to match and manage that club face position at
Is
top.
there a kind of a reverse sort of twist on the club to keep it from going that way?
So what you then often start to see is more so the hands would elevate more through impact. So this is often the missing part of that release story. We look at, say, how the wrists are moving, often independent of where the hands are in space. So we really can't look at what the wrists do independent of where the hands are. So an example, when you have these very, call it closed club faces, often what you can then see through the hand position is an impact. No, the hands will be much further, let's call it forwards, we'll keep it light today, and also moving upwards more through impact. That's another way of releasing the club into impact, but done and handle will move upwards more as a way of kind of managing that club face.
So if you want to create shaft lean, I mean, if compression has been an issue and you want to create shaft lean and that lovely sort of ball first then ground contact, one way to go would be have a slightly stronger grip, a stronger club face, and that will encourage you to self-organise the club into that handle forwards at impact.
Absolutely right.
And conversely, then, if you had an open face in the backswing, I mean, what's that going to encourage down through impact?
Often, what you then start to see is more than people slow the handle down. So when they start to actually, loosely speaking, pull the club head backwards. So again, for the viewers in particular, if the club face is very open at top of backswing, you often start to see people slow the handle down very early as a way of then allowing that club to be released into impact.
To get it squared up.
For sure. So although you'll see the wrist movement through certain ranges, what drives that movement is more so when they start to slow the handle down. They will almost decelerate the grip much earlier to let that club head catch up to square the club face up. Going back to your previous question there, often then the fallout from that is you then often see the hands, or you say forearms rotating more through impact. What really kind of encouraged that was they slowed the handle down earlier. So for the very strong face player, closed club face, you'll often see the hands much more ahead and elevated more. For the open face at top of backswing, they'll slow the handle down sooner and release that club earlier to allow for the open face.
Brilliant. So, which of course is less preferable?
It's very much, again, it's very hard to say right or wrong. Right for player A could be unhelpful for player B. It's very much, again, aligned with how they move through their body, the ball flight they're trying to play, their learning experiences, their movement history. There's many things that we have to consider as well. So the idea of right or wrong is very hard to define, but typically in the more established advanced players, you'd see more lean, more elevation on the hands than what you would say, for example, more recreational players.
And would I be right in saying probably less open faces at the top and less weak grips on tour?
Yeah, I think if you look at, say, historically, there's always an exception, which is what makes it great fun.
Yeah.
If you look at, say, the population, they'd be slightly stronger in terms of how they place their hands on the club, and the club face would be more closed. Why? Because it actively encourages then more, for example, rotations through their bodies for impact. There's always some, and I'm sure your viewers can list many very established players, open faces, they're just less frequent.
Yeah. So, for clarity, Mark, can you show us, and I know you don't like talking about ideals and absolutes, but in an ideal world, what would you like to see happening through impact, and in particular with this release pattern?
I think I often get a much nicer experience now with players and a better response looking at hand position rather than, say, wrist movement. The data almost universally displays this regardless. It's more so where the hands are at impact relative to their start position. Again, allowing for different clubs, tee shots, pitches, allowing for that. But on what we have here, 7-iron as an example, almost always, so very much face on to the camera for you viewers now, you'd see it impact. The hands would be slightly elevated relative to their start position. Keeping it very light today, the hands would be slightly forward relative to their start position. And also if the camera's the target line now, the hands would be slightly kind of left or inside of their start position. So when you start to explore where the hands are, the wrists will then start to rotate differently based on the change in position of the hand. So again, we look at, say, the address position versus impact. Almost always the hands will be further up, further forwards, and further left than their start position.
Mark, thank you so much for your time. So there we have it. Handle positioning, not so much wrist positioning. Handle up, left and forwards. Absolutely. And that will invoke a different response from your body as well. Amazing. Thanks.
Pleasure, Noel.
So there we go. Massive thank you to Dr. Mark Bull for his time and expertise there. So what do we know from that? Well, we know that there are a huge number of influences, very strong influences, that will kind of dictate your release pattern. The way we move our body, the force, the torque on the club face is massive, something we'll exploit more in the next video, the pitch of the shaft on the way down. So probably bigger influences than just our kind of mental concept of what we're trying to do. We know that skill level is a big factor, and that kind of pull and swoosh and turn over of the arms, the L to L pattern, again, still in my opinion is a great way to go, certainly in your formative years as a golfer, but it's unlikely to show up on the major tours where the handle would be higher, more forwards, and obviously the body rotated more so. So to the big question was, is it possible to keep that right hand in extension through the hit, a la the kind of Cowen model and lots of other sort of similar models that promote that? Well, we know from our conversation with Mark that the right hand is always going from extension into flexion and straightening up. And the difference would be, in terms of the data, would be very subtle as to when that happens. From my experiential perspective, from a player perspective, the actual difference for me from driving that right hand down and pushing to allowing it to kind of swoosh and release is huge. It feels really different. It feels different through my body. The contact is different. The compression is different. So from a data perspective, it might be subtle, but to me, the player, and it may just be sort of mainly my mental model, but it does feel very different. Now, in our next video, which is going to be linked down here, we're going to look to see if we can exploit some of those other probably bigger influences to change our release pattern. So if you're somebody who feels they're a bit flippy, we're going to go about changing that. Or if you're somebody who sort of drives the ball too low, we're going to use some of those influences to change that as well. So that's linked down below. But I hope to see you again. If you enjoyed the video, then please click subscribe. And until next time, good luck, play well.